Hi, my name is Walter and welcome to my garage. In this video, I'm going to show you what you need to inspect on a classic car or truck that's been sitting in storage for 5, 10, even 20 plus years with no maintenance or service, and how to plan for safe and reliable operation as you put your classic vehicle back on the road. Before we get started, a little bit about myself and then about the car. I started in the Mustang restoration industry in the late 80s, and in the mid 90s I transitioned into performance work. I've worked as an engine builder, a engine tuner, and then later taught people how to use chassis dynos. Around 2010, when we had the economy take an interesting shift, I found myself working out in the oil fields on gas turbine engines, and later as a fleet mechanic for an oil field maintenance company. After that, I worked as a Jaguar Land Rover technician for a while and found my career of choice, the thing I really truly enjoy, which is teaching automotive technology. And since 2017 I've been teaching automotive electrical at a trade school. As an ASE Master Certified Technician, I'm kind of uniquely qualified to tackle the restoration and performance modifications on my 1966 Shelby GT350. This car was purchased in 1987 by my parents, and the following year they put some time and effort into making corrections to the car to have it represent well as a 1966 Shelby would if it had left the Shelby American factory that way. Through the late 80s and the early 90s, they put about 3,200 miles on the car, and then in 1996 my father passed away and the car sat for several years. I got the car out, tuned it up. My mother drove it a couple hundred miles that spring, and when she was done, it was parked in the garage and there it sat. In April of 2015, I acquired the car from my mom and got it out of storage, got it running, started planning the restoration and some of the little modifications that I wanted to make to improve the driving experience. But I put that on hold because in 2017 I moved to Utah and became an automotive instructor. Since then I've been acquiring parts and planning, and here we are at the beginning of 2021, and I'm about to embark on a rather awesome project. The very first thing you're going to want to inspect on any car that's been sitting for a long period of time is the brake system. We can start by popping the caps, clips, and pulling the cap off of the master cylinder and inspecting the fluid level and seeing what's going on with the diaphragm seal. When your diaphragm seal is extended out like this, it basically tells you there's no fluid even before you look. The reason it extends out like this is as the fluid drains out, this cap seals to the master cylinder and it creates a vacuum. That vacuum is keeping moisture and air from contaminating the brake fluid, and in doing so, preserving what brake fluid is in there and preventing rust in the lines and other places in the system. So when you find the cap with the diaphragm extended out, you're going to want to find the leak somewhere in the system and then proceed to repair it from there. 1966 Shelbys all came from the factory with disc brakes. A couple of things that you're going to want to replace just because of age and unknown condition would be the brake lines, and then you're probably going to want to replace the pads even if they appear to be in good shape. If the car's been sitting for 30 or 40 years, it could potentially still have asbestos brake pads in it. You'll want to take care in disposing of those appropriately and make sure you don't breathe any dust in from those. As far as the calipers are concerned, the hose comes in on the back half of this 4-piston caliper, and we have this transfer line that transfers fluid across, and there's a bleeder at the top in the back and a bleeder at the top in the front. At the bottom, if you have any water or contaminants or anything that's gotten into these brake calipers, you're going to end up with corrosion around this bottom piston. So when you go to rebuild these, you want to make sure you take them apart, clean them really good, and service them properly. Another issue with disc brake cars, a lot of times people don't want to take the time to repack the bearings, and these caps come off relatively easy with a pair of pliers. The grease inside the cap is dried up from age. So that bearing assembly needs to be serviced. This one's not in bad shape for a car that hasn't been serviced in 30 years. These were serviced with a synthetic moly grease back in the 80s, and that grease has held up pretty well. I still wouldn't trust it for any high-speed driving or long drives. So plan on servicing your hubs. More than likely, like me, you'll end up swapping out the front rotors for a newer rotor. And when you do that, you'll want to use new bearings, grease everything, and maybe throw a new set of dust caps on there so that they look nice. Moving to the back of the car, we've found our brake leak. You can see there's a fairly substantial puddle on the concrete. You can also see that there's rust inside the brake drum. And if I pan up and over to our brake assembly, you can see that the wheel cylinder's wet, the shoes are wet, and the backing plate and inside this assembly is all wet with brake fluid. Everything on this assembly needs to be completely taken apart, cleaned, and because we have some broken springs here, a new spring kit will get installed along with a new parking brake kit. The whole assembly will be gone through. You have to be careful that you know what you're working on with these old cars. This, being a Shelby, has the 10 by 2.5 inch brakes, unlike a standard 66, which is a 10 by 1 3/4. The wider shoes and drums came off of a Fairlane. You can get the shoes relatively easily. The drums take a little bit of research to find suitable replacement drums, but they are available if you put in a little effort. Some of the little differences in the hardware, though, the pins that retain the shoes are longer for the 10 by 2.5 inch shoe, so you have to make sure that you use the correct pins, otherwise the spring that retains the shoe will be too tight and the shoe won't move properly and your brakes won't perform the way you want them to. While we're here at the back of the car, let's talk about some other service items. One of the things that you're going to want to pay attention to is whether or not this breather hose is intact. If that breather hose is missing, and they tend to be broken off right here above the nipple on the axle, if that hose is broken off, the vent tends to get plugged up with gunk, and you'll end up with pressure building up in the rear axle when the rear axle gets warm. That causes the fluid to try and push past the seals at the axle bearings. You end up with fluid in your rear brakes, in your axle bearings, and it's kind of a mess. So make sure that the vent tube and hose are intact and clear, so that you don't end up with issues there. I would strongly recommend pull the third member, change the fluid. If the car's been sitting for an unknown length of time, pull the axles, replace the axle seals, and while you're there, they're still relatively inexpensive, just go ahead and replace the axle bearings. Start fresh. If you don't know what you have, it's better to start with a known entity. Axle bearings, axle seals, third member gasket, and fluid, assuming there's no other issues with the rear end, are less than $100, including the labor to press the bearings. It's fairly straightforward and completely worth your time and effort for a productive return to the road. In 2017, when I went to bring the car to Utah, the fuel pump had failed. So I replaced it with the unit you see here from Carter. This is one of their street strip pumps. And I quickly installed this rubber line assembly with a filter in it, just to catch anything that may come from the fuel tank. Now, the fuel tank on this car was always kept full, and a full fuel tank serves a couple of purposes. One, it prevents moisture from getting into the tank and creating rust, and two, it actually cuts down on how much varnish you'll end up with in the fuel system. No question, the fuel on this car was pretty foul when I serviced the fuel system, but I haven't had any issues with any rust or contaminants coming from the tank because of the way the car was stored. When I pulled this car out of storage in 2015, it did not run. The carburetor that you see here was put on the car to make the car drivable at that time. This is just a 600 CFM Holley with center hung float bowls, nothing fancy. Now, when you have a car like this that's been stored for an extended period of time, one of the things that you're going to encounter is carburetor leaks. And this car has actually had some leaks develop in the 5 years, almost 6 years, since I pulled it out of storage. Your common leak points on a Holley are typically at the bottom of the bowl on your accelerator pump assembly, the bowl screws, and then occasionally you'll have leaks from the needle and seat adjustment screw. The other issue that you'll encounter with these is stuck needle and seats. The fix for that is typically to pull them out, clean them, put them back in as a temporary fix. As a long-term fix, replace them with new needle and seats. The ignition system on these old cars can also be a cause of some difficulties getting them to run. This particular car still has the hypo dual point distributor in it. The points and condenser have been replaced and adjusted properly, the dwell set. The cap was in good shape and had nice brass terminals in it, and the rotor is in good shape, so I didn't replace the cap or the rotor. But when I was working on the car recently, the spark plug wires that had been installed in 1988 had close to 50,000 ohms of resistance in some of them, which is more than excessive. So I made up a set of MSD Street Fire wires. This was a cut-to-fit set. I routed them the way I like them routed on a small block Ford. And the worst of these wires is about 1,800 ohms, which is substantially better for firing the spark plugs. Now the spark plugs, I've replaced all of the plugs with a set of stock Motorcraft plugs, and either Motorcraft or Autolite plugs run fine in these old 289s. But keep in mind that with modern fuel and with the high compression that these engines have, running big gaps isn't a good idea, so I generally recommend set the gaps on your plugs if you're running a points ignition to about 32 thousandths. And that guarantees a better spark and more consistent firing, less misfires. The cooling system on this car is in pretty bad shape. Having had no service since 1988, the coolant has started to eat its way through some of the components, like the gaskets and seals and even the pump and timing cover. If you look at the corrosion on the pump, it's coming through the bolt holes, and on the bottom of the pump there's a weep hole that allows coolant to escape from the impeller shaft cavity, and there's coolant, signs of coolant having come out of that hole as well. This pump is no good, and I have a sneaking suspicion the timing cover is also in pretty bad shape after all of these years. So when I address the cooling system on this car, I have not just a new pump, but also a new timing cover to put on the car. Sometimes the parts themselves will tell a story, and in the case of the parts we're looking at here, this coolant hose has a date code of 06-10-86, June 10th, 1986, making this a nearly 35-year-old heater hose. And we wouldn't want to run this hose even though it looks okay on the outside, and it is a genuine Ford hose. There's no way you can reasonably trust a 35-year-old coolant hose for any period of time. The upper radiator hose is also a Motorcraft hose, service hose, and has the Motorcraft logo and date codes and Motorcraft numbers. Again, that hose is not a hose that you can trust, and the reason for that is coolant hoses deteriorate from the inside out. So it might look perfectly fine on the outside, but on the inside it's in bad shape. You can see there's quite a bit of corrosion on the top of the radiator, and that corrosion is because the radiator cap had failed, and when I first fired the car up, it spewed coolant everywhere. When I took the cap off, the pin in the center of the cap had actually rotted away, and all of the guts of the cap, the spring, the seals, everything fell down into the neck of the radiator. Now, this radiator is out of another 1966 Mustang. It's not the original to this car, and if you inspect the core carefully enough, there are areas where the tubes on this radiator are leaking, so it will also be replaced. In addition to the radiator and the water pump and the timing cover, the thermostat, the hoses, and the heater core will all be replaced as part of the cooling system service, as well as the freeze plugs, because If we have enough corrosion that we're seeing leakage past the bolts on the water pump, chances are the freeze plugs are paper thin, and we're going to want to knock those out and put a new set in. The suspension is something else that you're going to need to do a thorough inspection of. Normally you would jounce test a car to check the shock absorbers. That's simply push down on the fender and the car should come up but not back down again. In the case of these shock absorbers, you can see that the bushings are falling apart and crumbling. These shock absorbers need to be replaced. I believe you can get replacement bushings for them, but it's not something that I'm going to waste my time with on this particular pair of shock absorbers. So with any classic car that's been sitting for a long period of time, if you don't know the condition of the parts, you're going to want to check them out. And the steering and suspension is an area that you really want to pay some attention to. Normally what you'll want to do is put a floor jack underneath the suspension, take the load off of the joints, and you're going to want to check your tie rod end links, make sure that the boots are in good shape, that there's no play, vertical play in the joint. They should move, but not too easily. You're also going to want to check the joint on the idler arm and the bushing on the idler arm. Now in the case of this car being a Shelby, the idler arm and pitman arm are unique to this car, and they're longer than a stock Mustang GT. So these components, you want to make sure that you don't accidentally mix and match and put the wrong idler arm or the wrong pitman arm on if you're servicing the steering components. The drag link, you're going to want to inspect the ball joint on the drag link at the pitman arm, and you're also going to want to check the steering box. The steering boxes on these cars are known to show some pretty significant wear. So if it's not a car that numbers have to match exactly, there are new service boxes available, and that might be an option for you. If you need a correct date matching steering box, you can send them off and have them rebuilt, which is probably what will happen with the box from this car. Now, as part of the inspection of your suspension components, you're going to want to check your ball joint on your upper and lower control arm. The boots should be in good shape. You should be able to get grease into them. And if you take a block of wood and put it between the control arm and the frame rail, there shouldn't be any vertical play in the upper or the lower joint. If there is, you need to replace them. Other issues that I'm seeing with this car, just simply from sitting in a desert climate, the bushing in the spring perch is cracked and pushing out. The original spring spacers that Ford installed on these cars were rubber, and this one has broken right down the middle. I plan on replacing the springs with a slightly better spring, so I don't intend to use any spacers or dampeners, but that's just something that you're going to want to consider if you run into problems with ride height when you're restoring the car and you put in a stock replacement spring. Those rubber spacers were used as a tool to set the final ride height and also prevent too much spring compression. So little things like that you're gonna need to deal with. The snubber on the outside of the shock tower, these are rock hard. I imagine if you pulled on it really hard, it would break off. those can be updated with either new rubber pieces, or there are polyurethane replacements available. But all of these components need to be inspected carefully, and you need to make sure that you don't have any undue wear in any of the serious major suspension components that could cause you to have a failure, lose a wheel, or have the suspension collapse while you're going down the road. That would be pretty horrible. Even on just a stock Mustang, it's still a very bad day when you have a problem like that. It doesn't have to be a Shelby. So make sure you check everything thoroughly. Some of the final things you'll want to inspect when you're underneath the car is check the transmission for leaks, check the engine for leaks, inspect the clutch if it's a manual transmission, check the clutch linkage, check the shifter linkage, make sure that everything is moving freely, lubricate all of those linkages so that they work smoothly. Just give everything a good general inspection and once over. If you feel like you're confident that everything's in good shape, then you can proceed. I would recommend pulling the transmission and the bell housing and inspecting the clutch. Now, you want to be careful with that because older clutches still have asbestos in them. And there's a misnomer that asbestos is illegal, and it's not. There are some countries that have completely banned it, like Australia, and you have to remove every bit of asbestos from a car if you're importing it into that country. But in the United States, it's not illegal. You can actually still buy clutches made using asbestos. So when you're taking these things apart, wear a dust mask, use what's called the wet method, where you wash everything down with brake cleaner so that you don't end up with dust getting airborne. The last thing you want to do is breathe in asbestos. It's not a healthy choice. So make sure you take care of yourself when you're working on these cars. The same thing kind of applies to the brakes if the car is old enough. Asbestos can still be found in old brake pads on cars that have been sitting for 30 plus years. So be aware of the asbestos hazards. If the car had an automatic transmission, chances are the pan will be leaking. You'll want to probably drop the pan, reseal it with a new filter and gasket, and while you're there, you may want to replace the O-ring on the dipstick tube, just because they have a tendency to leak. Also, the accumulator on the C4 and C6 transmissions, those have an O-ring on them as well, and over time they harden and they leak, so it doesn't hurt to replace those. Basically, you just want to make sure you get rid of as many of the leaks underneath the car as possible. Now, this car has the Shelby cast aluminum T-pan on it, and they are known to leak. They didn't have the manufacturing controls that we have now for making these T-pans back in the day, and so they fit reasonably well for 1966 equipment, but they could be better. So with the aluminum T-pans, it's not uncommon to have a leak on the corners near the rear main cap, on the corners in the front by the timing cover, front seal, and then another known area where these will leak is the actual drain plug. And let me see if I can turn the camera here so that you can see the drain plug. And this one is slightly wet. It's not terrible, but anyways, be prepared. You're going to have some leaks on an old car like this. While you're underneath the car, this is when you'll want to get in there and do your freeze plugs. It's not an easy job, but it's unfortunately a necessary job if the car's been sitting for a long time. Finally, before you hit the road in your newfound classic that you've rescued from that garage or that barn, One of the last things you want to make sure is that you have a relatively sound exhaust system. And no, I don't mean that it needs to sound good. I mean, it shouldn't have any leaks. Carbon monoxide is definitely something that can be an issue on old cars, and because carburetors don't do the best job of metering fuel, and there's no catalytic converters to burn off that extra fuel on anything prior to the mid-70s, you want to make sure the exhaust system doesn't have any leaks. Exhaust leaks can lead to carbon monoxide getting into the interior of the vehicle, which can make you rather sick. One of the first signs of carbon monoxide being in the interior of the vehicle is if you notice that you're running the car and you're getting a headache. That headache is most likely carbon monoxide poisoning in its early stages. So to avoid that, make sure the exhaust system's in good shape. Also, make sure that all of the plugs underneath the car, all of your rubber plugs for your seat bolts and any other plugs underneath the car, also the trunk lid seal, make sure that these things are in good condition and that they're doing their job sealing up the car. If you can keep the carbon monoxide from getting into the car, it goes a long ways towards keeping you healthy and enjoying the car more. I want to thank you for sticking with me this far into the video. I hope you've enjoyed the content and that it's given you some insight into your own project, be it a restoration or resuscitating a little old lady's car that's been under blankets for 30 years. And hopefully I've given you some good insight into things that you're going to need to check on a car that's been stored for a long period of time, and also a couple of hazards that still exist on these old cars that a lot of people forget about now, like asbestos in brake linings and clutches. If you want to follow along as I go through the process of restoring and some of the modifications that I plan on making on this car, please hit that subscribe button. If you like this video, by all means hit the like button, and if you want to be notified when the next video comes out, ring the bell for notifications. Until next time, thanks!